O'n i'n dweud mod i'n disgwyl am y cyfieithydd, a mae'r cyfieithydd ar gael. Diolch yn fawr, Steffan. O'r gorau, gobeithio bod chi wedi cael eich gwala o ginio. A dim ond un hysbys i chi, mae yna wybodaeth fel yma ar eich byrddau chi ynglyn â'r do-vote. Felly, mae angen i chi roi eich barn i'r llywodraeth, a mae'r holl atebion yn ddienw, felly byddwch yn onest. Ac mae yna 3 cwestiwn i'w hateb, a ddylai gymryd llai na 3 munud, neu 3 munud, mae'n dibynnu ble ydych chi'n byw, o ble ydych chi'n dod. Lle os dawch chi ddilyn y ddolen sydd ar eich byrddau chi. Do vote, blaenslash Symposium. O'r gorau. Felly, rydyn ni symud ymlaen yn gyflym yn pnawn yma i glywed gan Kevin Palmer, sy'n ddirprwy gyfarwyddwr yn Llywodraeth Cymru gyda chyfrifoldeb dros addysgeg arweinyddiaeth a dysgu proffesiynol. Mae'n glamp o deitl. Ond croeso, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Afternoon all. I get the postprandial torpor slot, don't I? Always get that slot. Can I just apologise for some of my colleagues? There are people here who know me, and they'll have expectations of this presentation that I can't possibly fulfil because they've only given me 15 minutes. There's no stories, no jokes. It's just going to be dull. So I'll just tell you who I am. Kevin Palmer from Welsh Government. I've only been in about 4.5 months, not that I'm counting, colleagues from Welsh Government, but I've had a bit of a learning journey over 4.5 months in the context of my job, which is, part of which is to develop the National Professional Learning Model. So what I'm going to address is almost the last slide, I think it was the last slide from earlier on, which is if we're going to do this, we're going to need a significant investment in high-quality professional learning. So I'm going to talk about that for 15 minutes. I wish I had longer, but I'll just go faster. So if we start, let me take you to the slides I want to take you to. Don't worry about that one. I'll start with that one, which is the simplest possible definition I could imagine of professional learning. And all I've wanted to say in here, and it's probably the bottom right slide in English for me to look at, which is there is learning in our lives which is not professional, and there's behaviour in our jobs which is not learning. There's professional behaviour which is not learning. But there's this special thing called professional learning, and I mean that. When I say it's special, I mean it has special characteristics and requirements. And it's not an exact science, and it hasn't really been a science, if we're honest, but there's quite a lot of evidence around for what effective professional learning should look like, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. So if we start with why we need it, I just got a couple of slides on context. Many of you will know some of this, and all of you know a little bit of it, but not everybody knows everything. So we know where we are with curriculum reform. That includes modern foreign languages as coming back into the curriculum in ways that it might have not been in the curriculum for the last number of years. It certainly includes Welsh as having a new springboard. So what we've said is in our new curriculum, we want young people to be something as well as to learn something. And that is a very different approach to the curriculum. There's something of a shift in what we expect practitioners and leaders to be able to do in teaching in and running our schools. The higher levels of autonomy and agency in school classrooms and offices that will require new skills and approaches from our practitioners and leaders. The second thing is our government committed, this is nothing to do with me, I wasn't there when this happened, our government committed to a national approach to professional learning to be launched in the autumn. So I'm currently on a bit of a pacey journey to get us there, to have an approach, which we will launch in November, a national approach to professional learning. You'll see the foundations of that shortly. And I think just by way of a justification for having a national approach as opposed to something more laissez-faire, there's a few things I want to highlight here, and those of you who work in schools and in regions and local authorities know this, that there is significant and I think intolerable variation across the country, across the regions, within the regions and across even schools in the provision and experience of professional learning. It's too ad hoc. There's too much variation, and that is in access, entitlement, and the quality of experiences, and particularly in the impact of those experiences on practice and young people. So I don't apologise for saying it's intolerably variable. It needs to be better everywhere, and it needs to get to a higher bar everywhere. And so what we've said is we need a model, and the highlights there again. We need a model that doesn't tell people what to do. The model is a heavily co-constructed model. But what it does is describe our expectations of the system's behaviour, so our policy and the way we resource our policy. We need a model that will express design criteria for professional learning activities. And we need a model that is clear about the entitlement of practitioners in the system. And that's what I'm about to show you is an attempt to do that. And as I go around it, I'm just going to go around the clock in a sec, you'll say, oh, right, that's a policy thing, that's a design thing, that's an entitlement thing, and hopefully those things will all stitch together over a few minutes. So I'm going to go with, I think, bear with me a sec, I'm just going to focus on this image of the model, and I'll describe as quickly as I can what all the bits do. But it kind of comes with a health warning that behind each of the bits is a significant investment in the evidence base for all of the bits. And for colleagues who know, this might be a good way of explaining it. If you know the Sutton Trust Toolkit, the way it presents itself on the web, you'll see that on there you've got a summary of the things, then you can go down to a level of detail, then you can go down to a level of exemplification and case studies and so on. When we publish the model, that's the kind of paradigm within which we want to publish, so that everybody in the system has got as clear and detailed an account of it as we can possibly provide. But I'll just talk you around it from the centre outwards and then round the clock. So in the centre you see, hopefully it won't surprise you, you see the learner. And the learner's got two meanings in this context. There's the learners that we teach, as children and young people for whom we're responsible, and they are the centre of the model because they are the centre of what we do. But of course, also we're professional learners. Our teachers are learners, and that's as it should be. Then what's meant by the phrase strategic context is the context of the school. So all professional learning needs to take account of the context of the school, whether that's a big national thing like 2050 or a small thing like the school's socioeconomic profile. The off-the-shelf, off-the-peg, fit-for-everybody stuff in professional learning just doesn't make sense when each school is so different and the strategic context and operational context of all of its practitioners are so different. So we've said, if we're going to make sense with professional learning, we have to take account of the context within which the practitioner works. I'll go to the very outer circle last, but I'll start at 1 o'clock on the clock face now. The first element is a thing we call pedagogy for professional learning. What we mean by that is that there's a well-established and well-evidenced account, and some of you have seen a version of this in the old 4 jigsaw pieces. Anybody remember the old 4 jigsaw pieces? Essentially, a combination of design elements that we know from the evidence base make professional learning work. So that will be all of these things, a common expectation through the model that there is a well-established pedagogy for professional learning, and we'll expect programs and opportunities to be designed according to it. The next line down as we come to 2 o'clock on the clock face is what we call the professional learning offer. Across the middle tier, as we call it, across the regions and HEIs and ESTIN, now with the new report, there will be codified, publicised professional learning offers. Those professional learning offers need to be consistent with the model. They need to be consistent with the imperatives of the model. And in particular, you'll see there's a line there that says allocated time. They need to take account of what the evidence tells us is the best way of using professional learning time. Right now, that is really quite habituated in the system. You know, the 5-day inset model. That model doesn't work. And what we'll produce when we come to November is a suite of options for schools and leaders in models of using time that do work. Third item down, about 4 o'clock, is accreditation and recognition. You won't be surprised to hear that it was the HEI community that suggested accreditation be part of the model, and rightly so. Accreditation is the main currency of recognition for professional learning. And in this country, we've got HEIs who provide us with postgrad accreditation, and we would want that to be an option for all professional learning. But we've also got the opportunity to recognise as opposed to accredit professional learning, and the best example there is probably NPQH. Colleagues who know about NPQH will know it's not a formal academic qualification, but it's nationally recognised. All of our professional learning ought to be portable. If I do something in Wrexham, it ought to be recognisable in Swansea. And right now it isn't. If it's not accredited, it's not recognised, apart from that one example. So we need to work on a model of consensus-based agreed system-wide recognition. At the bottom of, about 5 o'clock, at the bottom of the table, we've got professional teaching and learning standards. And you'll know that those have recently been issued. They're being used by NQTs now, and they will be used by the whole profession from September onwards of this year. And what we've said in that model is all professional learning that you experience or that you provide if you're a provider should be framed in the professional learning standards. So when I start my journey as a professional, I'm measuring my progress in that journey by the standards. So it's appropriate that I should frame my learning in the context of those standards. So our expectation will be that professional learning will present itself in the context of the professional teaching and leadership standards. And of course in the TA standards when they come out this year as well. The next line up, coming about 6 o'clock, is this notion of collaborative networks. One of the most powerful sets of evidence around professional learning is that it is most effective when it's undertaken in collaborative networks. My original language for this was clusters, and I'm really comfortable with people thinking about collaborative networks as clusters, but there are other kinds of collaborative network as well. So what we'll be encouraging people to do is think beyond their school, beyond their local authority, in the networks and clusters in which they operate as foci for their professional learning. I think so far, none of that's terribly surprising, but the next couple of bits are relatively new or entirely new in our country, so I'll spend a little bit more time on them. At about 8 o'clock, we've got the individual professional learning journey, and that's quite new as a systemic idea in the model, and what it means is that every practitioner is entitled to articulate a professional learning journey for themselves that their leadership supports them through. Now, at the moment, in effective settings, that's a kind of year-long thing described and prescribed by the school development plan. But we're in a 5-year transformation process. So what we're saying is professionals need a longer-term professional learning journey than is currently being afforded by the system. And for me, the best example of that is to say, I'm a Key Stage 3 history teacher. In 5 years, Key Stage 3 and history will have changed, and I'll be left with teacher. So over those 5 years, I need to move my thinking on about what I am as a practitioner, and that takes time. At about 9 o'clock, we've got learning organisations. If you recognise that phrase at all, you probably recognise it as schools as learning organisations. And the schools as learning organisations is the institutional context for professional learning. And we'll be seeking to work with our leadership colleagues and to work with people aspiring to leadership to ensure that that SLO piece is deeply embedded in the way schools think about how they work with their colleagues. And the same across the middle tier. We know that the regions and HEIs and others are working on themselves as learning organisations, and in Welsh Government, we're about to kick off a government as a learning organisation project, because if we're going to make them do it, we thought we'd better have a go. We're being taped here, aren't we? Yeah, okay. We are doing it. Crack that after. But learning organisations as the institutional environment for professional learning will be a very powerful tool. And then finally, on the clock face, is this notion of the professional learning blend. And what the blend says is there are broadly 3 ways in which people learn stuff. They learn stuff in direct instructional experiences that we call classes or workshops, whatever we call them. They learn stuff when they sit side by side with another teacher and talk about it, and they learn stuff digitally through the e-route, as we would call it. In teaching as a general profession globally and nationally, and certainly in this country, that e-component is radically underexplored and underutilised as a part of our delivery mechanism. So the model will say that we expect that component, the E component, alongside the others, to be maximised to enhance and enable access across the whole system. And I've heard, with my BBC colleague, my new friend BBC, I've heard some reference to that around content earlier on today. So you've got those 8 components in the model built around the learner and the school, and then around the very outside, these are the last comments I'll make, you've got evidence and impact and evidence, and those are different way around for a reason. Firstly, we expect that all professional learning opportunities should be premised on evidence of need and a statement of impact. Not, I've got a really good trainer in literacy over here, so yeah, that's what you're getting, but an actual account of why this professional learning is needed. And I've seen loads of examples of just how that works this morning. And then at the bottom, we need to have evidence of the impact of that PL on practitioners' behaviour, on their practice over the longer term, and on outcomes for learners. So there's no point on us, as it were the old days, providing a course, a one-day workshop, not knowing why we were doing it, other than we've got the staff to doing it, and then not knowing what impact it had 6 months down the line. Those things really do need to change where they happen. So that, I have no idea what my timing is, but that's a very quick run round the model. Am I all right? Okay. That's a very quick run around the model. So just to give you a sense of 30 seconds, what happens next. I'm involved in lots of conversations with regions, ESTIN, HEI, schools over the next 2-3 months. We've commissioned a load of research to analyse the evidence that sits behind all of those components, and we will be in time to publish and then launch in November a sequence of head teachers conferences, that new model. And it's that new model that will underpin the way we resource professional learning for folk who've got to make work all the wonderful things that I've heard described today. All right, thanks for your time.
Diolch yn fawr, Kevin. Mae'n galonogol clywed yn dydi am y cyfle sydd yn y cwricwlwm newydd, a hynny fe hyderwn i hyrwyddo'r Gymraeg, ac yn y cynlluniau i sicrhau darpariaeth mwy cydlynus ar ran datblygiad proffesiynol, a'r angen am hynny sicrhau sgiliau iaith y gweithlu. Felly diolch yn fawr. Rydyn ni'n troi nawr at yn siaradwr olaf, ac arweinydd y grŵp ymchwil a luniodd yr ail adroddiad, chi wedi dderbyn eisoes, sef yr Athro Tess Fitzpatrick. Mae'n athro mewn ieithyddiaeth gymhwysol ym Mhrifysgol Abertawe, ac mae'n bennaeth yr adran Saesneg a ieithyddiaeth gymhwysol. Mae ymchwil Tess yn canolbwyntio ar brosesu geirfa, ac mae'n arwain y grŵp ymchwil astudiaethau geiriadur. Mae ei gwaith ar gaffael a phrofi geirfa ail iaith yn cael ei ddylanwadu gan ei gyrfa gynnar fel athrawes a hyfforddwr. Mae Tess wedi byw yng Nghymru ers dros 10 mlynedd ar 20, ac mae ei hadnabyddiaeth o Gymru fel gwlad ddwyieithog yn bwydo i'w gwaith, ac yn enwedig ei rôl ymchwil bresennol ar brosiect Corpws y Gymraeg. Felly croeso i Tess.
Prynhawn da, diolch Marian. I was just trying to calculate how many years I've been living in Wales, so thank you for reminding me of that. That's very useful. I wanted to start by saying what a precious opportunity this is. I think several people in the room concur with this. As researchers and as higher education teachers, the opportunities to actually engage with stakeholders of our research, practitioners, policy makers, materials providers, facilitators, and so on, is very precious and regrettably rare. So I'm pleased that we all can take advantage of being here together today. There are some voices missing, I think. Claire mentioned that there's not a pupil voice as such in the room, perhaps not parental and community voices in the room either. But as Parvana mentioned this morning, we are differently invested in Welsh language, in the language of our communities. My own investment, if you like, in Welsh language comes from the 29 years that I've been living here, and as my experience also as a teacher and teacher trainer of English to adults. That's where my career began. And also as the parent of children who've been through English medium education in Wales, and importantly as a language learner myself, including as a learner of Welsh, but I'm not going to demonstrate my wonderful Welsh capacity to you today. But one thing that does make me realise, and I think a lot of people in the room share those anecdotal and personal experiences, is the fragility of learning a language and how exposing it is to learn a language. Whether you're 5 years old or whether you're 50 years old, it does bring you to different kind of self-awarenesses and self-identities, and putting yourself out there can be quite a dangerous thing. And I could track, if anybody's interested, I won't talk about it now, but my own experience as a Welsh language learner through those very extreme highs and defeats. And I think that's something to bear in mind. One of our partners on the project, Ros Mitchell, who I'll mention later, has actually looked at this in some depth by videoing classes in primary schools, language classes in primary schools across a whole year, focusing on an individual child and seeing the sort of, when they don't get their chance to say something, and the rejoicing when they do and get it right. So I think if we can, as we're talking about this, bear in mind that kind of fragility and exposing that goes with becoming a language learner. However, I'm not here today to talk about personal experiences. I'm here very much as a researcher and to talk about a piece of research that we've done with very clear research parameters. It's a piece of desk research, but it does look at other research that uses real-life learners from across the globe. So the research that I'm going to present to you in a minute comes from papers that look at all sorts of language pairs, Spanish speakers learning Catalan, Taiwanese speakers learning English, Farsi speakers learning Swedish, and so on, from across the board there, all of which has a relevance to our context in Wales. So, you can see there the title of the kind of broad aims of what we were researching, and our piece of research was framed as a rapid evidence assessment, and I'd just like to pause on that for a moment, because you'll need to be listening to the findings and listening to the lessons from this with a critical eye. You need to know where this research came from. So it was rapid. I've put the dates there because they still fill me with dread every time I look at them. We did this piece of research within a 4-month period, more or less. That's the rapid bit. The evidence is the research base, which I say is from across the whole world, and our assessment of it I'll explain to you. This means, as I say, please do be critical in the sense that you should be listening to this, I hope, taking on board what has emerged from this rapid evidence assessment, but also with a mind for what it didn't capture. We tried very hard to make it capture as much as was relevant as possible, but you'll notice there are things that we haven't managed to capture within it. So, our main question that our REA aimed to answer is this: what teaching approaches and methods are effective? How do we measure effective? Okay, we'll come to that. In developing young learners' second language competence, according to high-quality empirical evidence. That was our challenge. So we set this challenge last autumn, and I worked very closely, I should say. My partner on this project is Steve Morris, who's here today, and we were very fortunate to work with a group of very accomplished and relevantly experienced researchers. It's quite hard to marshal them all together at a month's notice. We're quite proud of ourselves for having done that. So there are some faces that we worked with. Those are the authors of the report, our co-authors. Steve Morris is in the room here. Ros Mitchell is a professor of applied linguistics in Southampton University and did that wonderful filming of children in the classroom. And the other 4 people there, Tony Clark, Jenny Needs, Lizzie Tange, Beth and Tovi, all have PhDs in relevant areas. And they were wonderful research assistants on our project. And together as a team, we combine the expertise in the little tiles that you can see there. So we have our research expertise is in applied linguistics, second language acquisition, Welsh language, and learning and teaching generally. We as individuals have between us several language teaching qualifications and some classroom experience. Most of it, I think, teaching adults, nevertheless classroom experience. And we have expertise, we like to think, you can be the judges of that, in evaluating research, conducting critical literature reviews and research syntheses. So those are our credentials, if you like, those are the credentials of the team. And I'm going to take another 4 slides now, I think, to tell you about what this literature is based in, and actually what the challenge is of being asked to synthesize, to crystallize the research that has been done in effective second language teaching. Can you imagine how much research is out there? Well, I'll let you guess how much research is out there now by telling you that we started by getting a sense of the scope of the challenge. Scopus is a massive, some of you must have worked with it, a massive abstract database. Lots and lots of, most of the important published research in the world, in English language certainly, in other languages as well, is captured on Scopus. So our preliminary database search, we thought we'd use those search terms there. I don't know how well you can see that. So we're looking at people who are young or child or whatever. Language, we didn't include specific languages there. That would have made the findings bigger. Teaching them, and we're looking at methods and approaches. So how many items, how many papers, how many findings do you think you get when you put those search items into Scopus? This was the size of our challenge. Well, you get over 500,000. And in October, when we found that out, and we thought, we've got to report on this by March. How are we going to get through all these 500,000? We need to do something else about our search protocols, we thought. And we thought, well, okay, that's all research that's been published. What about the stuff that's just been published since the year 2000, for example? That'll help us out. So we fed in 2000, and it reduced to not very much better. So we still had our head in our hands figuring out how we were going to get through this. We worked quite hard then to think about what actual research we were aiming at. And we needed to think about who our population was. So the search terms there, child, pupil, student. What our context was, which was schools. What our targets were, second language, and it was teaching. And we were interested in things that told us about improvement, effectiveness, and so on. So we refined our database search, extended, as you see there, the number of databases we were looking at. And we found that we had a manageable, it depends on your perspective, but 5,000 items. So that's the basis of the items that we sifted through to tell you the findings that I will get to in a minute. We were very anxious. We all come from research backgrounds, and we knew that captured a lot of the papers we knew about, but it didn't capture all of them. And we needed to be unbiased in our approach. So we had some backup plans. The other problem with this is that it only captured English language outputs. So we reported on additional evidence from an expert advisory group, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them later. This was a group of people who sent us what they would look at if they were charged with recommending research that combined classroom pedagogy, looking at 3 to 16-year-olds, the experience of 3 to 16-year-old learners in a non-dominant language environment. What would they advise us to look at? And they came up with 129 new, in the sense that we haven't found them already, papers to look at. And that was important to us because it meant that we were catching those things that had slipped through the gap. We also looked at books as well. We searched for young language learners in books. That gave us some more, 75 book chapters. And at Welsh language database searches. So our research assistants also searched the Swansea University and National Library of Wales databases for things that came out of Welsh language database searches that were relevant, and there were 81 of those. So those things all together are our research evidence. So later on is your chance to say, oh, but you won't have captured this, and what about that? We're pretty sure that we captured quite a lot of relevant stuff. So the next challenge that was our search. We're left with 5,800 pieces of work. Again, that was a bit of a head in hands moment. But we needed to figure out which of that research was eligible for this particular purpose. And so we narrowed this down by saying, does this publication relate to effectiveness of an approach or a method? Does it engage with pedagogy in the classroom? So that's one thing about the research I'm presenting here. It's only about what happens in the classroom. Is it relevant to our young learners? And is it relevant to the teaching of Welsh in Wales? Now, that doesn't mean to say that we excluded papers that were talking about teaching English or teaching Spanish or teaching other dominant languages. We didn't exclude them. But if they were saying, when you're faced with a multilingual classroom and you've got first language speakers of 20 different languages in front, that's probably not going to be relevant to to our Welsh in Wales context. Okay, so what do we do with these? We ended up with 309. That's looking a bit better, isn't it? A big sigh of relief there. But now the challenge of a rapid evidence assessment is that you assess that evidence and you say whether or not it's fit for purpose, what the quality of it is. It's a pleasure to be able to see in this slide just one little box of text that represents the 57 questions we answered about each one of these papers. That was quite a piece of work, that weighing up of the evidence. But we did that, and we were able to conclude that 105 of those research outputs were high quality and highly relevant, so the highest quality, the highest relevance to our area. And those are the ones from which emerged the findings I'm going to tell you about now. The reason I've been through that journey is because it's important to note that there are those other 500,000 papers that we're not talking about today and that we haven't investigated. And inevitably, there will be important findings in that. We know what some of those will be about. They'll be about issues that Parvena brought up this morning that we've mentioned already in our table discussions. They'll be about motivation and community and context and aspiration and things like that. But they might also be about methods as well, and we just haven't, that just hasn't bubbled to the surface. So those really are my caveats, I suppose, that it's important to talk about. We can come back to some of those issues later, I guess. But for now, let's see what the 105 journal papers, book chapters, PhDs sometimes, commissioned reports sometimes, that we deemed to have high quality empirical evidence. What did they tell us? Well, what we had to do, having captured all this, was say, how do we actually express this? How do we make this manageable? And we came back to this idea of second language competence. Competence is a word that we hear again and again, including in the Donaldson report. And it's something that is not... I, as somebody who had taught languages, I know what competence means. It's all that speaking, listening, reading, writing stuff, isn't it? And we tried to rethink that. And we said, well, maybe it's more than that. We did a lot of investigation, grouped the research and the findings from those papers, and to our surprise, probably not to your surprise, we actually came up with a framework which pretty much mirrored the things that I have trained as thinking of as those boring divisions of competences. So we've got reading, writing, listening, speaking, grammar, and vocabulary, and we grouped our research into those. And that means that if you look at the report, which looks like that in paper, looks like that actually online as well, on the Welsh Government website. If you look at the report, you'll see that we grouped our findings under those competences. But what I've done now, because I thought it was important for this context, to see if we can draw out kind of approaches and methods and capture them under that. I've tried to capture them under different settings, you'll see. So I'm going to report some of the findings now. This is, actually, I think in this room is where the magic happens, if there's any magic to be done. It's in the conversations that happen in this room. If we're expecting any magic to happen, and we know there's no silver bullet, right, in terms of approaches and methods. So there's not one of those, but there is very, very good classroom practice that's reflected here, and some quite surprising classroom practice, I think, that has been shown to work very well as well. So I'm going to start with the probably not very surprising stuff and move towards the, to me, surprising stuff towards the end of my talk. Okay, so slow down a bit now to let us comprehend and actually try to think about in our own context what these things mean. Parvena focused on CLIL. It's no surprise to us that CLIL emerges as one of the, from a lot of the papers that were deemed to be high quality. There's a reason for that, actually. One of the assessments of quality of research paper, especially quantitative research, is the number of instances that are reflected in that paper. So typically the number of learners or the number of learning contexts that are considered in a single piece of research. CLIL papers about CLIL, typically, especially if they come from somewhere like northern Spain, have a huge advantage in that respect. Researchers in northern Spain can go into a CLIL school and a non-CLIL school and immediately will have an example of an intervention that is experienced by 1,000 learners at a time, 1,000 learners at a time in the other context as well. Whereas in some of the interventions that you'll see me report on here, the trialling inevitably has to be limited to 20 learners at a time. And it's harder then for that kind of research to emerge as a high quality paper. It can do, but the numbers behind the CLIL research are very, very compelling. So, what did we learn about CLIL? We learned that in the reports of CLIL approaches, content and language integrated learning approaches, there was some evidence all the way through. We're researchers, we hedge things. We know that whatever we find is a strong finding, there will be another research paper that comes out and says, actually, no, that's not true anymore. So what we're going with here is kind of majority evidence. Evidence of gains in vocabulary tests in some but not all areas of grammatical competence, and in spoken production, not necessarily pronunciation. That reflects, I think, a lot of what Parvana talked about this morning and what a lot of us know anyway. There are some buts to the CLIL context. Evidence isn't consistent, even in schools that are a context that seem to be applying CLIL in similar ways. And it's very difficult to disentangle CLIL from the extra exposure to target language that CLIL contexts tend to carry along with them. So apparently you're looking at a benefit of a CLIL context, but sometimes we can't say whether that's just because there's been more exposure to the target language. There were also things in the research about whether there's an optimum age to be applying CLIL or experiencing CLIL, and whether there are optimal or even damaging aspects to whether CLIL is applied consistently. What happens if you've had CLIL at primary school and then you move schools and you haven't got CLIL? What happens to your language competence and so on? So there's a lot of contextual things to go around that. But generally speaking, in terms of gains, competence, CLIL gets a tick for the vocabulary, some areas of grammatical competence. Spoken production, whether that's accuracy or confidence or normalising, is debated in the literature too. So that's our tick for CLIL. The other approaches, now there's 4 more, I think, slides with different approaches. They're a little bit less traditionally defined as an approach or a method. My training as a language teacher was from many, many years ago before I even moved to Wales, and I am very ingrained in that, well, is it an audiolingual approach? Is it a communicative approach? Is it so on? Those have gone out the window now with the post-method zero, but still the things that we talk about here aren't necessarily things that you would see as approaches. Now, there's been a lot of conversation in the room, quite rightly, about the role of technology and the role of data-driven learning, which we might know by other names, but it's looking at examples of language and using our inductive powers to actually figure out what's going on with language when that comes. Yeah, okay, I was going to say something else about that, but that would have got us onto language savants and so on, and isn't particularly helpful to the context. So, data-driven learning. So this is the sort of thing that those of us working on the Welsh Corpus project are particularly interested in. We're hoping to produce a resource that facilitates data-driven learning by taking lots and lots and lots of examples of Welsh being spoken or written or used on e-language across lots of contexts, and be able to facilitate the presentation of those to learners, for learners to navigate their own way through the language, to use their own detective skills to figure out what's going on in language. And some very powerful research, some of which has come out of Canada, actually, says that data-driven learning develops language sensitivity. This isn't necessarily specific language. This is general language sensitivity, noticing, inductive skills, that stuff that you need in order to not be afraid of language and not have that I can't do that moment when you see the language or hear the language in front of you. Inevitably, also, data-driven learning encourages autonomous learning and engagement with authentic language. Those are things that are hard in some contexts to actually make happen in the classroom. Data-driven learning is a way into that and has been shown to be effective in that regard. A little bit about technology now, more about technology later in the surprises slide. But the overwhelming message about technology, and this was technology, whether it's used to enhance writing skills through electronic devices, whether it's to enhance listening and reading, whether it's gaming, whatever it happens to be, the overwhelming message is that the use must be informed. And that the learners, just because they're younger than the person teaching them, doesn't mean they're technological wizards and that you will just be able to put a device in front of them. They will know what to do with it in order to be able to learn languages. That's not necessarily the case. Did you see that report on, I think it was probably Apple, that dropped a load of iPads into some community, and was it in Somalia, I think, and left children just to figure out what to do with those iPads. And the report was, isn't it amazing? All of the children managed to know what to do with them in order to be able to learn. Well, sadly, this research indicates that that's maybe not the case, and just giving the learners the technology isn't the whole story. It's got to be done in an informed way, and they will need to be trained in using that technology. That was a very strong message. And teachers in the room probably, it'll be no surprise to you to say that use of technology requires very specific classroom management techniques. It's about keeping people on task whilst at the same time offering freedom and exploration and so on. And that's a tough thing to do in a classroom. When it's done well, then the technology really shines through and can be very directed and very effective. And effective was our buzzword. Okay. Next is focus on form and focus on forms, which some of you will be familiar with. The very kind of nutshell description of the distinction is that the focus on forms is when we have specific input targeting grammatical, usually structures, language structures. Focus on form is that opportunity to focus on a structure because it's part of a communicative activity or something like that. Big debates again in the literature about this. But the findings generally told us that strategic focusing of attention, again, the strategic thing shone through. Strategic focusing of attention on form and meaning, and that link, enhances vocabulary uptake. And looking at spoken form, so attention to prosodic features of speech, rhyme, rhythm, and so on, can actually aid grammar competence. There's some interesting outputs relating to that. Phonological training, so again, that focus on spoken form, can help beginners especially process word forms, but not necessarily word meanings. So again, these kinds of pluses and minuses going on here. There's a but, of course, there's a but. We talk a lot about communicative teaching methods, the importance of communication, and that was a message here as well. Approaches creating meaningful interactions are possibly more beneficial to speaking, at least, than focusing on the form. And that, again, strategic deployment, form-focused instruction should be strategically deployed, might be more beneficial to older children. That's what came out of the research there. So 2 more slides on methods, if you'll bear with us. Interaction, not really a method, okay, but it underpins a lot of the methods and approaches that are used in the classroom. And it actually crosses all the competencies. So, interactive writing tasks, making writing interactive, promotes proficiency, promotes engagement. Game-based activities, we talked about playing games early on, technology games, promote pronunciation, communication. Next one I think is more surprising for me. Online interaction can be as effective as face-to-face interaction for speaking development. One of our criteria was, is this relevant to the Welsh context? And we felt, yeah, that is relevant to the Welsh context, where in some contexts of teaching, it's quite challenging to get the amount of face-to-face interaction into the classroom that's necessary. Online interaction can be as effective. Opportunities to interact and to make errors are hugely important. This freedom to make, I should say, so-called errors in communication are important. And a particular finding is that input-only instruction has been hugely criticised in the second language acquisition field since it was introduced in the 70s. Isn't this fantastic? We can sit a child in front of a TV, put the TV on a different channel, language channel, and they'll absorb what's being said. And since then, people have said, it just doesn't work. Sorry, it'd be nice, wouldn't it? It just doesn't work. There were some interesting findings around this. Input-only instruction can help with vocabulary. If it's supplemented with interaction, even more so. And I'll tell you about a specific, very Welsh relevant study that looked at that in a minute. But first of all, let's look at autonomous learning. So autonomous learning strategies to become a language learner, not necessarily a speaker of Welsh, but a language learner, a bilingual, include things like computer-assisted reading. That aids autonomy. People will have access to computers to help them understand language in the future. It aids autonomy, enhances focus. lots about strategy instruction and the importance of strategy training, and how actually if you arm a learner with a whole wealth of strategies, even a very young learner, that can enhance their attitude to as well as their proficiency in language learning later on. Okay, now we're at the surprises. There are surprises. There were surprises to me. I'm very well aware that other people in the room will say, oh yeah, of course, we've known that for years. Anyway, surprises to me then. Some ticks at the top, some words of caution at the bottom. Forgive the animations. This is the stuff that I had a sort of a step back moment for. Vocabulary uptake, first of all. Aided by integrating creative imagery. What's that all about? Well, the keyword method, actually there was a lot of work done on that in Swansea 20 or so years ago. The keyword method, and there's my little dog, key. I mean, that's what it's about. It's about finding a first language word, an image from that, and then relating it to the second language word, and having that picture of the dog and the key in your head at the time. That is very controversial because it relates to ways that we know that language is processed and language fluency and so on. I think it's a fascinating area of research, and I was really pleased that some of the literature that emerged as high quality was actually promoting that keyword method and saying that it's not only effective in terms of memory, but it's also effective because it's quite compelling, it's quite fun in a classroom. Next one, watching L2 television. Well, who'd have thought it? But there was a very strong piece of research that was done in Bangor by actually, as it turned out, we did conduct this in an unbiased way, one of our advisors on the project, Entley Thomas, and one of her students, on watching L2 television and the effect on very young learners, so people in a Welsh-speaking school, but who were English-speaking at home, and these were children of 4 years old, something like that, very, very young, and having a targeted S4C program that they were put in front of, that they watched daily in school, possibly weekly in school, actually enhanced their vocabulary. They measured their vocabulary knowledge, largely, I imagine, because that was the obvious and a relatively straightforward thing to measure in children so young, but that enhanced their vocabulary on its own, and that if they watched it with an adult who could then talk to them about it in either language afterwards, that enhanced their vocabulary even further. So that's something when we're looking at our Welsh context, and there are some areas of Wales, as we know very well, that find it hard to put that much language exposure in front of young children. That was a nice finding for us. Vocabulary uptake is not aided by gesture and movement, which is what those guys in yellow and pink are supposed to be doing at the moment. We think of gesture in language classrooms as being a good thing. The research we read said not so much, unless it is an effective thing because the children are excited while they're doing it or something like that, but actually specifically enhancing language, not so much. Automatic speech recognition, feedback aids pronunciation. So if learners can speak, and you don't have that power thing that Parvana talked about again, with a teacher in a room who's the authority, they've got the authority on their desks there through automatic speech recognition. The sad news, I guess, is that there's little evidence to suggest that use of songs actually promotes language uptake. Sorry about that. Be encouraged, though, to know that there's some very, very powerful research from Taiwan that tells us that interaction with robots can be as effective as face-to-face interaction. There are a lovely pair of papers there, one of which says, you take some sort of robot into a room and the children enjoy talking to it. It's not the same as talking to a teacher or a teaching assistant or something like that. They can enjoy that. And the fabulous follow-up piece of research to that is that if you dress up the robot to look like a cuddly toy, it's even better. They engage with it even better. So those were nice findings. The calendar is there because there's also little the evidence suggests that short but intensive bursts, so I've got the week lined out in the calendar there, intensive bursts of language teaching are more effective than drip feeding programs, which resonates, I think, with a lot of what actually is experienced in English medium schools at the moment, but intensive exposure is more powerful. So those are our surprises. I wanted to find time to spend on that, but also on an important finding. So we were focusing on approaches and methods. a lot of the research we found said more influential than approaches and methods are the things you can see listed there and the things we've talked about in the room. Teachers' language competence and confidence, opportunities for language exposure, societal and educational context, effective teacher training, teaching skills, amount, intensity, timing, variety, all of these things we know about, motivation being the strongest of all. Caveats to the research, I've already run you through those. We only captured what you can capture in a REA. But I wanted also to mention that these are our project team who are our authors. We were very, very lucky and we worked hard to be able to capture input from other experts in the area of language teaching, language acquisition, some in the Welsh context, some not there, from a variety of contexts, including Catalonia, including the Irish situation, and so on. So we were able to capture those. Those were the experts that said, oh, you need to look at these papers as well. And some of them had written those papers as well. And together, our team do represent, and I say this because we always are very conscious standing here as researchers that there are teachers there out there who spend every day in the classroom. I don't spend every day in a language classroom anymore, but a lot of us on the project have had experience of doing so. And there's a list of all the areas of expertise that were represented in that project. These are good people who are very, very, even if they're working outside Wales, very committed to this as an opportunity for bilingualism to develop in an area of the UK and for people to look seriously at teaching languages and teaching a second language, second community language in schools here. People are the researchers we work with are very, very compelled by that. So, our question, how can we enhance the effectiveness of second language Welsh teaching in Wales? Well, we put that question to that team of experts right at the beginning of the project when we were kind of finding our way, figuring out how to navigate this. And we said, what do we need to think about? So this was the result of that initial brainstorm, if you like. And you can see there are things there that we haven't touched on, certainly on the research that I've reported to you here, because the research here only really looked at the things that I've ticked there. We only had space to look at that. But we don't want the other things to get lost along the way. And, sorry, it probably makes noise when I do that. Particularly, the final chapter of our report looks at psycholinguistic, sociolinguistic, educational and affective issues. This can't be understated. The importance of motivation, attitude and identity. That has to be, as far as a lot of us are concerned who work in this area, has to be the starting point. This is the approaches and methods are a good grounding, but without the motivation, attitude, identity in place, it's a hard battle and very hard to think that we'd ever win it. So we're talking about social context and social support, which is why I mentioned pupil groups. Parent voices, guardian voices, community voices are important in that as well. Of course they are. This concept of the rooted L2 self, the idea that being a Welsh person, aligning with myself as a Welsh speaker, with myself as a Welsh person, and all of the kind of cultural heritage, which also always sounds to me like it's about history and old stuff, but it's not. It's very relevant. We've heard about pop cultures and about sports and things like that. All of that rooted L2 self, I think, is something to kind of cling to and hook things onto. The idea that we are working towards people not only being Welsh speakers but having plurilingual identities, being multilinguals, bilinguals, and really harnessing, capturing what that means. Things like classroom experiences, those are the things that can either, if you've got a flicker of somebody being interested in learning a language, the classroom experience can either plummet them and think, oh, no, this isn't for me. I was wrong about thinking of myself as a Welsh speaker or as a bilingual because clearly I can't do it. Or thinking, gosh, I made a little victory there. Those are important. We know relationships, we know from all the research that was done in the 70s in Canada, right, that attitudinal stuff, your relationship with the teacher, your relationship with the language and the speakers of that language is important. Sociocultural aspirations and motivational strategy work, absolutely crucial to this work. Those are the effective factors. There are also some other factors there that are more experimental. I think there, from the conversations I've had, there might be people in this room who are working at the edges of these things. but thinking about multilingualism and especially biliteracy as a route into language learning or language acquisition, I would say. If we're talking about biliteracy, teaching English and Welsh literacy side by side and somehow integrating that, I think that could be a really exciting way forward and a way that teaching in Wales can contribute to larger pictures of literacy, as we know from PISA results and so on. That requires a huge amount of innovation. People in this room, I am persuaded, are the people to start that innovative process, but obviously there need changes to the way we think about assessment and so on as well. Those are kind of big messages. Our summary then, if I've still got time, our headline findings are on those slides. We found it hard to think of headlines. You start with 500,000 pieces of research and you come up with 5 headline findings. There's an awful lot that's going to have been lost along the way there. But just to focus on those, headline findings across the board. The learning environment should facilitate exposure to the target language, including in non-traditional and creative ways. This needs thinking outside the box. This needs harnessing technology for those purposes. Attention paid to the learner's linguistic landscape. We know what we think of the linguistic landscapes. I don't know what a 5-year-old sees as their linguistic landscape now with the new technologies and in Wales today. I don't know. And the society and educational context, which we can engage with more easily, I guess, as adults. Technological and developments and tools offer hugely valuable opportunities for language teaching and learning, but they must be used in an informed way, otherwise they're a distraction or there are opportunities missed. Teacher education came out hugely from the research. Easy to say, right? It should be focused on producing teachers who are responsive to learning needs and processes. And from the research, those learning needs and processes aren't generally, that they are also distinguishing one learner from another, but it's distinguishing at that moment in time, in your classroom, that learner over there, what do they need to get to the next step? That's the $1 million thing. One of the papers that we looked at was Making the Minutes Matter in Language Classrooms by the wonderful Patsy Lightbound, and I think it's that Making the Minutes Matter that came out of this as well. And finally, powerfully, $1 million question, motivation and attitude are key to this. I'm very well aware that a lot of the stuff that I've just talked about now isn't news to you. I was going to say it's not rocket science, perhaps it is. That's why we still have to be here and talking about these things. But I think I can be very confident, Steve and I and the team can be very confident that these come out of a very measured and a very unbiased review of the literature that's out there. The literature itself is biased, of course, towards certain languages and towards certain approaches. And if you do a study where you trial something and it doesn't actually work out to be very good, chances of getting it published are fairly slim. So, you know, there are all those caveats as well. But I think we've got the start of something valuable here, I hope so. And we've captured quite a lot of these on a handout that should be on your desk. Of course, they're in the report as well. And it only remains for me to say a big diolch yn fawr to our colleagues in Swansea, Steve's and my colleagues in the Department of Applied Linguistics, the Department of Welsh, the Library Information Services colleagues who were very, very helpful and invested in this, it should be said. And I also would like to thank Katrin Redknapp, who did an excellent, and she was very challenged with navigating us through this process of a kind of research which was very different from what a lot of us were used to doing, used to working on. So thanks to Katrin and to the whole team, and diolch to everybody here for listening to this. Thank you very much.
Wel, dyna chi ymchwil eang a chyfoethog. Mae yna wrthgyferbyniad falle rhwng y robotiad a rhyngweithio ystyrlon. Ond diolch yn fawr iawn, Tess. Mae gennym ni falle rhyw funud i am gwestiwn neu ddau. A dim mwy falle cyn bod ni'n mynd i nôl i drafod. Os maic sy'n gael yn rhywle? Bryn.
Can I have a question in Saesneg?
Iawn.
You did actually mention the issue of Welsh identity, that those children, in fact, who come from a non-Welsh speaking background need to identify with their own Welsh identity. I learned something. I'm sitting next to Shaunette here, in fact, who, in her report, actually said the importance of learning Welsh within its historical context, and that, in fact, we should be teaching more about the history of Welsh language as well. I learned something from an Irish activist very recently in Belfast. When I referred to Welsh as being a minority language, and he said, no, I've got to correct you, he said, you shouldn't be using the term minority language. It's a minoritized language. And connected to that, I had a student last year who in fact became a fluent Welsh speaker living in Cumbria. And the reason, in fact, he learnt Welsh and became fluent in it because Welsh, an older form of Welsh, was spoken in Cumbria in the 6th century. I wonder how many people in this room are aware, in fact, that Welsh was the dominant language in most parts of Britain. And that, in fact, English is an immigrant language. Anglo-Saxons are immigrants. You should be aware of that. And that, in fact, the original British are the Welsh of the Celts, and the Scottish the Irish. So shouldn't this be a fundamental part of the education of the children in Wales, that the Welsh language, in fact, should be placed in that historical context, because it is a huge motivator, and I know for a fact from actually marking a PhD thesis from Cardiff University last year, that when local government officers were actually had to be trained in the language policies which local government had to introduce, they were absolutely amazed when they were actually taught the background, historical background, and the question that was being asked by some of them was, why on earth weren't we taught this in school?
I'll respond to that. There are a number of things actually in your comment there. Is this microphone on? Yeah, can you hear me? There are a number of things in what you asked there that are very, very relevant, I think, to some of the research that we've been done and to our identities. So the kind of surface question, I suppose, is whether we should teach these things in school. I think that those kinds of historic backgrounds, the knowledge that the Celts arrived 2,500 years before, at least 2,500 years before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, for example, and I've lived in Wales, as we all know now, for nearly 30 years, but I originally come from Kent, and Kent is a Celtic place name, and through the place names in Cumbria, for example, I think that's where a lot of my own language exploration comes from. I think in the classroom, it's about factoring in whether, if that's a way of capturing relevance and belonging for children, for students, then that's what we focus in on. And when we have a group of students in front of us, a group of learners in front of us, we don't know what'll capture. This guy's imagination will be which football players are Welsh speakers. For this person's imagination, it'll be, well, actually, I don't come from Wales, I come from outside. But isn't that interesting that, you know, that place name that I know comes from these particular roots and that I come from Cumbria or whatever. For this person, it'll be that, you know, that Dad was talking to them about a pop star who speaks, whatever it is, it'll be very, very personal. And I think none of those things should be ruled out. I think the historical issue, and Steve was probably smiling when you said about the minoritized thing, it's very, very hard to actually figure out how to describe. We talked about non-dominant languages, but the minoritized issue is something that I think would capture people's imaginations in a lot of cases. But there's an
awareness of linguistic injustice does by an imagination and motivation as well.
Right. And the other useful thing, I think, in looking at those language comparisons is that part of being a language learner and sensitive to language, whatever the language happens to be, is noticing those things, noticing that place names look weird in certain parts of the country, you know, all of those Viking place names up in the north and so on, and noticing, using that it's data-driven learning. That is exactly what data-driven learning is. It's looking at these exemplars of language, looking at Irish language and Welsh language and so on, and figuring out from that, letting emerge from that what's interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Dwi'n credu mae'r eirfa allweddol yw cymhelliant agweddau a hunaniaeth yn dyfan. Dwi'n credu bod e'n bryd i ni nôl i drafod. Mae gyda ni rhyw 3 chwarter awr, hytrach nag awr i drafod. Felly, atawch chi nôl, os gwelwch chi'n dda, ac os fedrwch chi gael eto un person i gyfnodi, un i adrodd nôl, ac i feddwl am 2 bwynt, ambell i bennawd yn unig, mwyn i ni gael clywed gan bob bwrdd pan dyn ni'n dod nôl fan hyn, ymhen rhyw 3 chwarter awr, os gwelwch chi'n dda. A dwi'n credu bod angen i fwrdd 6 symud allan eto i'r stafell arall. Dwi'n siŵr. Maen nhw'n cael aros, ydyn nhw? Chi'n cael aros?
Reit,
da iawn. Felly, trafodwch am y 3/4 awr nesaf.
Right, so discuss for the next 3/4 of an hour.
Sa mynd i symud eto. Ti eisiau just dod i wneud, ond y bod yn onest,